Hey folks, it's Sean here from the Calling Out community and CallOut Films. And today I'm continuing my video series, Last Days Dawning. With a Bible in one hand and a newspaper in the other, I will show how the biblical signs of the times, which warn of a worldwide time of chaos and suffering to come called the Tribulation, are being fulfilled right now, today. In our last video, we looked at Jesus' prophetic sermon in Matthew 24:6, where he warned of a time in mankind's future where there would be wars and rumors of war. In verse 7, he said that individual nations and whole empires would someday fight one another. And today we continue in that verse where he stated, "For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places." And Luke 21:22 also says that there would be famines and pestilences, and fearful sights and great signs shall there be from heaven. Now, the word famine is from the Greek limos, which is literally hunger or scarcity of food, or a famine, and pestilence comes from the Greek loimos. We don't really use that word anymore. We know them better today as plagues, which is a devastating, contagious, or infectious epidemic disease. And Mark 13:8 also includes this same prophecy of Jesus, but it too reads slightly differently. "And there shall be famines and troubles. These are the beginnings of sorrows." Now that word troubles comes from the Greek terake, which refers to a disturbance, commotion, a tumult, a sedition, in other words, rioting. Now, when we think of famine in the world, according to this biblical prophecy, we have to consider that poverty is the foundation of it all. Because if a people can run out of food locally, they could always buy more food and bring it in from farther away, unless they financially have no ability to do so. Poverty is the key. Currently, the World Bank reports that 41% of the world, over 3 billion people, live on less than $2.50 a day, the largest poverty-stricken population in world history. At least 80% of humanity lives on less than $10 a day. The poorest 40% of the world's population accounts for just 5% of global income, while the richest 20% in the world makes 75% of all the world's wealth. The international development charity Oxfam reported in 2016 that the richest 62 people in the world had the same assets as the poorest 3.6 billion people. But they'd miscalculated the true poverty levels in China and India, and therefore they had to revise the report in 2017 and stated that the richest 8 billionaires owned the same assets, about $426 billion, as the poorest 50% on Earth, about 3.5 billion people. And that inequity between the rich and poor will just continue to grow. And when the gospel writers were alive, there were approximately 150 million people in the entire world. Imagine their shock and horror to see a vision of the future when, according to the Food Aid Foundation, 923 million people are undernourished, consuming less than 2,000 calories a day. That's more than 6 times the entire population of the Apostles' day. And the vast majority of the world's hungry people live in developing countries where there's no support structures in place at all to help the population in need. Asia is the continent with the most hungry people, 2/3 of the total, while Sub-Saharan Africa is the region with the highest percentage living in constant hunger. 25% of all of the people in that region are undernourished. It's quite curious that in the last 150 years, white people have almost completely avoided famine around the world. And I'm one of them. In fact, the only famine that's ever affected white people has been caused by war or genocide intentionally. That's very strange because the rest of the world suffers from drought, disease, and other natural disasters that have affected crops over the last 150 years, but not Western powers, and I don't think that's a coincidence. I do believe that famine can be used as a weapon, and it has been for very specific reasons that you're about to discover. Now, poor nutrition causes 45% of all deaths of children under the age of 5. Over 3.1 million children every year. Folks, let me tell you, no parent should ever have to bury a hungry child.
What we're about to show you is almost unimaginable in its horror. These are 9-month-old Aqil's last gasps. Filmed inside a local clinic, Aqil died as the medical team fought to revive him. His desperate father borrowed the money to bring him here, and all he's leaving with is a little body wrapped in white. In hospitals and clinics across Yemen, time is running out. Little Muhtasim is also 9 months old. He struggles to even keep his eyes open. Support for the war in Yemen is waning, and many US lawmakers want out. Although US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says without American involvement, life here would be worse. It's hard to see how. Ni'm al-Baghir, CNN, London.
1 out of every 6 kids, approximately 100 million in developing countries, are underweight. Contrast that now with statistics from the Centers for Disease Control in the US, where 18.5% of American kids are defined as obese. Over 13.7 million children and adolescents. Clearly, their overindulgence would save all of the children dying of starvation around the world several times over. Do American children really deserve to live more than they do in the developing world? And most horrifying of all, a third of all of the world's food is just wasted.
$31 billion worth a year, just in Canada. Food goes to waste on the farm, in transit, in processing plants, in restaurants, and in our homes.
Just wasted. Mostly in Western countries. That would more than cover all of the undernourished and truly starving people of the world, and still have plenty of extra. So the issue is not one of being able to produce enough.
The world produces 3.5 million tons of garbage every day, and that number is increasing. What's being done about it, or not, is the subject of a recent report in the Washington Post called Drowning in Garbage.
Lagos has 2 waste dumps. One of them is really big, it's really hot, and it came across as apocalyptic. You have these garbage trucks. Those trucks are surrounded when they're still driving, when they're still backing up. Hundreds of people with hooks waiting for the truck to discharge their waste. It was incredibly well organized because everyone who's there has a task, is looking for a particular item like plastic or paper or textiles. And those are the items which will go into the recycling chain, which otherwise would have never happened. There are thousands of people who work and live on those landfills. They pick out stuff which can be recycled, but it's really dangerous work, not only health-wise, but also because the mountains of waste are so high now that they often collapse. Next to the waste dump in Jakarta, there's a lot of small industries. At this small plant, the big bags with plastic are being brought in. There are several guys who are opening those bags. They are checking what's inside the bags. It's often kids, they're often not from Jakarta, who work in these plants. They came from the countryside to make some money. They melt the plastic. So it's being thrown into a big burner, and it comes out as some grayish or whatever color it has, paste. Obviously, people don't really wear any protection. The smell you can imagine from burning plastic is not very healthy. It's really bad for their health. It comes out as shreds of plastic, basically. It became for me much more understandable why people do this work. You know, because it does bring them some money. Some of the families do manage to send their kids to school and to that they will not end up like their parents working on a dump like that.
Now, the United Nations World Food Program calculates that only $3.2 billion is needed every year to feed all 66 million hungry school-aged children around the world. Now that sounds like a lot of money, you say, but let's put it into perspective, shall we? 3.2 billion is 9% of the total profits of Apple computers in the last 3 months alone. They made $35.4 billion profit in 3 months. 3.2 billion is the price that PepsiCo paid in August 2018 for Israeli soda drink maker SodaStream. It's also the first quarter 2019 profits of the Royal Bank of Canada alone. It's also the amount that Canadian National Railways will spend in capital upgrades in 2019 alone. It's the same amount that Google paid in October 2018 to buy smart home products maker Nest. It's also the amount that Dallas-based Texas Instruments has announced planning to invest to build a new semiconductor. It's also the amount that the Ford government in Ontario announced in budget cutbacks in November 2018. $3.2 billion is the amount that Aurora Cannabis spent in May 2018 to buy a rival pot grower in Canada, Med Red Leaf. It's the amount that the Los Angeles Metro has budgeted to build a new Purple Line as of a meeting February 28th. It's also the amount of free federal government money for college students that was left unspent by America's high school graduating class of 2018. The Bible says, "To whom much is given, much shall be required." The problem is greed, it's gluttony, it's waste, incompetence when it comes to adequate distribution, storage, shipping of food. How will we be judged by God when we're literally drowning in waste and garbage here? At the same time, some in our society seem to almost be content with letting parts of the world even starve to death, stating that there are too many people in the world in the first place. Perhaps it might even be better if we thinned out the herd. So folks, at the risk of sounding blunt, it's not a problem of having enough resources. It's about priorities. It's about giving a rip about other people in the world besides ourselves. It's about ending the gluttony and need to overuse the world's resources that the West seems to be affixed on. In the 1970s, overpopulation hysteria came fully into vogue. Stanford University biologist Paul Ehrlich published The Population Bomb in 1968, which opened with this zinger of a line: "The battle to feed all of humanity is over." In the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. Shortly thereafter, in 1972, the Club of Rome, and yeah, that doesn't sound like a suspicious group at all, issued a report called The Limits to Growth. It spun the same tired old narrative that population growth would deplete resources, lead to a collapse of society, which they gained from computer simulations based on highly suspicious assumptions. Now, those bad news bears led to human rights abuses. In 1975, officials sterilized 8 million men and women in India alone. Now, were these human rights abuses necessary? Of course not. Instead of facing widespread starvation and resource shortages, guess what? Humanity managed to figure out how to use resources more efficiently, how to increase supply, how to even develop a substitute when it was required. Again, the Western world is going to have to answer to God directly for our incredible hoarding and waste of resources that could lead to more than feeding the entire starving world put together. So-called leftist experts also love to drag out the pathetic excuse for world famine today of overpopulation. In fact, in a powerful July 30th, 2018 article in Forbes magazine, they state, "Today the population is at a record high, and famines have all but vanished outside of war zones." Sorry? Even in sub-Saharan Africa, the poorest area on the planet. The food supply now exceeds the recommended 2,000 calories per person per day? Yet overpopulation fears still exert a powerful hold on the public imagination. Bill Nye, the science fraud, support tax penalties or other state-imposed punishments for having, quote, too many children, unquote. Now I'm going to get even more blunt. I think the problem of world hunger and famine today is both man-made and even, to some degree, intentionally. And who would do something like that intentionally, you might be thinking? Well, the Guardian newspaper in the UK reported in June 2009 that Prince Philip, the husband of Queen Elizabeth II, was quoted in 1988 as stating, "In the event that I am reincarnated, I'd like to return to Earth as a deadly virus to contribute something to solving overpopulation." Ted Turner, the outspoken founder of CNN and ex-husband of environmental activist Jane Fonda, was featured in an article entitled "Ted Turner Talks of Overpopulation" from a newspaper headquartered close to his Montana ranch. It stated in 1996 that Turner said he also put $125 million of his own money into a foundation to support environmental and population control efforts in the U.S. and abroad. The endowment spends about $6 million a year on projects designed to lower the world's population from the present $6 billion at that time to $2 billion or less.
We've got to stop doing the two suicidal things, which are
Nuclear
hanging on to our nuclear
weapons
and
global
and then after that we've got to stabilize the population. When I was born, there
so what's wrong with the population? I mean,
with too many people. That's why we have global warming. We have global warming because too many people are using too much stuff. But if there were less people, they'd be using less stuff. If we don't get global warming and the nuclear weapons straightened out, we don't have to worry about human rights. Well, the humans will all be gone. You know.
Okay.
Not doing it will be catastrophic. We'll have 8 degrees. We'll be 8 degrees hotter in 30 or 40 years, and basically none of the crops will grow. Most of the people will have died, and the rest of us will be cannibals. Civilization will have broken down. What the few people who are left will be living in a failed state like Somalia or Sudan, and living conditions will be intolerable. The droughts will be so bad there'll be no more corn growing. Not doing it is suicide.
Speaking of Turner, on May 31st, 2009, The Guardian reported that something called the Good Club had formed, a group of the world's richest billionaire philanthropists who had their first highly secretive meeting in the heart of New York City. Members of the group included Ted Turner, Bill Gates, George Soros, Warren Buffett, Oprah Winfrey, and David Rockefeller, who were worth a combined $125 billion. The meeting was called by Gates, Buffett, and Rockefeller, and as The Guardian reported, for 6 hours, the assembled billionaires discussed the crisis facing the world. Each was allowed to speak for 15 minutes, and the topics focused on education, emergency relief, government reform, the expected depth of the economic crisis, and global health issues such as overpopulation and disease. Now, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation is worth $30 billion, the largest in world history, and one of its biggest projects is vaccination programs around the world. Wouldn't saving millions of lives be contrary to their stated goals of dealing with global health issues like overpopulation? Well, Bill Gates explains it himself.
Now, we put out a lot of carbon dioxide every year, over 26 billion tons. For each American, it's about 20 tons. For people in poor countries, it's less than 1 ton. It's an average about 5 tons for everyone on the planet. And somehow we have to make changes that will bring that down to zero. It's been constantly going up. It's only various economic changes that have even flattened it at all. So we have to go from rapidly rising to falling and falling all the way to zero. This equation has 4 factors, a little bit of multiplication. So you've got a thing on the left, CO2, that you want to get to zero. And that's going to be based on the number of people, the services each person's using on average, the energy on average for each service, and the CO2 being put out per unit of energy. So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. That's back from high school algebra. But let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, health care, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, health care, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
Now, many YouTubers have shared that clip in the past and left it at that point, which spins a conspiracy that Bill Gates is using vaccinations to somehow kill millions of people. That's totally disingenuous. But Jesus said in John 8:32 that you shall know the truth and the truth shall make you free. So here's what Bill Gates actually meant in his own words.
In this year's annual letter, Melinda and I take the toughest questions we get asked and give our answers. One that's come up for a long time is, as we make the world healthier, is the population going to get so big that feeding everybody and maintaining the environment is going to be impossible? Here we can see a chart that looks at the total world population over the last several hundred years. And at first glance, this is a bit scary. We go from less than 1 billion in 1800, and then 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7.4 billion where we are today is happening even faster. So Melinda and I wondered whether providing new medicines and keeping children alive, would that create more of a population problem? What we found out is that as health improves, families choose to have less children. And this effect is very, very dramatic. We find that in every country of the world, this is repeated. The population growth goes down as we improve health. So we've taken that chart that shows the global population growth, and we've actually extended it out all the way to 2100. And we can see that instead of continuing, it actually flattens out. Another way to see that is through this rate of population growth. And you can see that in the 60s, that reached a pretty high number, over 2% per year, and it's now come way, way down. Now, 11 billion people, still a lot, but the good news is that the faster we improve health, the faster family size goes down, and so we can feel great about saving those lives.
The Georgia Guidestones is a granite monument erected in 1980 in Elbert County, Georgia, inscribed with a set of 10 humanistic goals in 8 modern languages. No one knows exactly who created this monument, it's anonymous, but it's sometimes referred to as the American Stonehenge. Regardless, the message on it is quite clear. It calls for population control, eugenics, and globalism. Now, I'm not here to promote the Georgia Guidestones, but the first guideline, possibly the most shocking, relates to what I'm talking about today, where it says, maintain humanity under 500 million in perpetual balance with nature. And the last guideline is equally telling, be not a cancer on the earth, leave room for nature, leave room for nature. Now, you can't get to a population of 500 million unless you first kill 6.8 billion people today. Wired magazine said that others may have labeled these 10 guidelines as the 10 commandments of the Antichrist, and he might not be far from reality. Now, I think it's important for us to remember that in the very first chapter in the Bible, Genesis 1, after God created Adam and Eve, he said in verse 28, be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. He didn't also add, until you hit about 8 billion, that is, because that's not going to be sustainable, you're on your own, man. And if that population was really going to be too much for the earth, God wouldn't have allowed man to grow to that point. Again, it's worth being reminded that it was God that told man to multiply. multiplication of people on the earth today is actually the plan and will of God. And sadly, John wrote in the book of Revelation that a quarter of the earth is going to die from famine and disease and the sword and wild animals, whatever that looks like. But based on our current population, that's at least 1.8 billion people that will be killed. And based on what we've seen, it probably won't be because we just didn't have the resources. That's just not the case. I believe it could be more intentional than that, as the guidestones suggest. And continue to watch this series as we continue to show you how this really is the last days dawn.